May 15, 1944. The Adriatic coast of Italy shimmered under an unseasonably warm afternoon sun as Private James Whittaker, 19 years old and barely 6 months out of basic training, adjusted the heavy headset over his ears. The signal crackled with static, competing with the distant rumble of artillery that had become the soundtrack of his life. Whittaker believed he was about to relay routine reconnaissance coordinates, just another mundane task in what had become a war of inches and waiting. He had no idea that in approximately 7 minutes, his exhausted brain would make an error that military historians would later call the most fortunate mistake of the Italian campaign. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a simple miscommunication would cascade into a perfectly orchestrated ambush that would not only save hundreds of lives, but fundamentally alter the strategic calculations of an entire theater of operations, proving that sometimes the most decisive moments in history emerge not from brilliant planning, but from the unpredictable collision of human fallibility and extraordinary circumstance. Private Whittaker sat in the back of a half-track vehicle that bounced along the rutted coastal road, surrounded by radio equipment that seemed to multiply with each passing week. The Americans called this stretch of Italian coastline the Forgotten Front, where progress was measured in yards rather than miles, where every hill concealed German positions that had been fortified over months of meticulous preparation. Whittaker had joined the 24th Infantry Division as a replacement after the brutal winter campaign, arriving with the naive enthusiasm of someone who had never heard the specific sound a mortar shell makes in the seconds before impact. His commanding officer, Captain Robert Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco who spoke 3 languages and possessed an engineering degree from Berkeley, had specifically requested Whittaker for this reconnaissance patrol, not because of any special talent, but because the previous radio operator, Corporal Davidson, had been struck by shrapnel 2 weeks earlier and evacuated to a field hospital in Naples. Whittaker was simply the next name on the roster, a fact that Captain Chen would revisit countless times in the months that followed. The patrol consisted of 12 men crammed into 2 vehicles, tasked with probing German positions along a section of the coastal highway that intelligence reports suggested might be lightly defended. These reports, compiled from aerial reconnaissance photographs and partisan informants, indicated that German forces had recently withdrawn several units to reinforce positions further north, leaving a potential gap in their defensive line. The mission was straightforward. Advance to Observation Point Tango 7, assess enemy strength, report findings, and withdraw before dark. What military intelligence had not detected, and what partisan networks had failed to report, was that the German command had indeed withdrawn several infantry companies from the coastal positions, but only to mask the arrival of an entire armored battalion that had been repositioned under cover of darkness over the preceding week. This force, consisting of 23 tanks and approximately 400 infantry, was preparing for a counteroffensive designed to push American forces back from a strategic crossroads that controlled access to 3 separate supply routes. The German commander overseeing this operation, Major Klaus Richter, was a veteran of campaigns in North Africa and the Eastern Front, who had learned the hard lessons of overextension and supply line vulnerability. At 41 years old, with a face weathered by 3 years of continuous combat, Richter understood that modern warfare was less about heroic charges and more about logistics, timing, and the careful management of limited resources. His orders were explicit: remain concealed until American forces committed to an advance along the coastal highway, then strike with overwhelming force to create a salient that would threaten American supply lines and force a general withdrawal. Richter had positioned his forces in a natural amphitheater of hills that overlooked the coastal road, using the terrain and dense olive groves to conceal the distinctive silhouettes of his armored vehicles. His soldiers had spent 3 days camouflaging their positions, draping nets over gun barrels, and establishing observation posts that provided clear sightlines across 2 kilometers of open ground. It was, by any military standard, a perfect ambush position. All it lacked was a target. Captain Chen studied his maps as the half-track jostled along, comparing the hand-drawn intelligence overlays with the actual terrain features visible through the vehicle's open sides. Something felt wrong, though he could not articulate exactly what troubled him. The landscape seemed too quiet, the usual signs of German defensive preparations oddly absent. Where were the communication wires strung between positions? Where were the freshly dug earthworks that typically characterized German defensive doctrine? The absence of obvious fortifications should have been reassuring, but Chen had survived long enough to distrust easy answers. Private Whitaker, meanwhile, was battling exhaustion that made his vision swim and his thoughts sluggish. He had been awake for nearly 36 hours, having spent the previous night monitoring radio frequencies for any indication of German movements. The headset pressed against his ears felt like it weighed 20 pounds, and the constant crackle of static had begun to blend with the ringing in his ears that never quite went away anymore. He had consumed 4 cups of coffee that morning, requisitioned from the supply sergeant, who hoarded the precious grounds like gold dust, but the caffeine had long since metabolized, leaving only a jittery nervousness and an overwhelming desire to sleep. At 13:47 hours, the radio crackled to life with a transmission from battalion headquarters, located 7 miles to the rear, in a commandeered farmhouse that still smelled of olive oil and aged cheese. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Morrison, the battalion communications officer, a former high school teacher from Ohio, who spoke with the precise diction of someone accustomed to making himself understood over classroom noise. The transmission was straightforward. Red Horse 3, this is Overwatch. Intelligence update. Enemy strength at Tango 7 estimated at company strength, approximately 150 infantry with light support weapons. Proceed to observation point and confirm. Acknowledge. Whitaker reached for his notepad with hands that trembled slightly from fatigue, scribbling down what he heard through the static-filled transmission. But exhaustion played tricks with comprehension. Where Lieutenant Morrison had said, company strength approximately 150, Whitaker's overtired brain processed battalion strength approximately 1,050. The difference was enormous, transforming an assessment of modest defensive positions into a report of major enemy concentrations. Whitaker turned to Captain Chen and relayed what he believed he had heard. Sir, battalion update. They are saying Tango 7 shows battalion strength, approximately 1,050 enemy infantry with support weapons. Chen's head snapped up from his maps, his expression shifting from routine focus to sharp concern. Repeat that, Private. Whitaker consulted his notes, his finger tracing the hasty scrawl. Battalion strength, sir. Approximately 1,050 infantry. The captain's mind raced through the implications. A force of that size represented a major German commitment, far beyond what the intelligence summaries had suggested. If accurate, it meant the reported withdrawal was not a redeployment, but a concentration, a gathering of strength for offensive operations. More importantly, it meant that proceeding to observation point Tango 7 with 12 men would be suicidal, and that the planned American advance scheduled for the following morning would drive straight into a trap. Chen made his decision in less than 5 seconds. Radio battalion, tell them we are aborting mission and returning to base. Enemy strength too significant for reconnaissance patrol. Request artillery support on coordinates I'm about to provide, and recommend immediate halt to tomorrow's advance. Whitaker transmitted the message, his voice steady, despite the sudden tension that had filled the vehicle. Behind him, the other soldiers sensed the shift in mood, hands moving unconsciously to check weapons and adjust equipment. They did not know what had changed, but they recognized the signs of imminent danger. At battalion headquarters, Lieutenant Morrison received Whitaker's transmission with confusion that quickly transformed into alarm. The report contradicted every piece of intelligence they had received over the past week. But Captain Chen was a trusted officer, with a reputation for cautious accuracy, not prone to exaggeration or panic. If Chen was reporting battalion-strength enemy forces, the situation required immediate attention. Morrison walked quickly to the operations tent, where Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was reviewing the following day's attack plans with his staff. Harrison, a career officer who had commanded a battalion through North Africa and Sicily, listened to Morrison's report with the expression of a man watching his careful preparations collapse. Chen is certain about this. Battalion strength. That is what his radio operator transmitted, sir. Chen is requesting artillery support and recommending we halt tomorrow's advance. Harrison studied the operations map spread across the folding table, marked with colored grease pencil, showing planned attack routes, supply lines, and objectives. The entire scheme depended on the assumption that German forces had thinned their coastal positions. If instead they had concentrated a major force precisely where the Americans planned to attack, the result would be catastrophic. Get me confirmation from air reconnaissance. I want every available spotter plane over that sector within the hour, and get the artillery battalion on alert. If Chen is right, we need to hit them hard before they can disperse. What followed was a cascade of military activity that would have been impossible to coordinate if not for the urgency conveyed by Chen's report. 3 spotter planes were diverted from other sectors, climbing to altitude where their pilots could scan the terrain through binoculars while circling out of range of ground fire. Artillery batteries, which had been preparing for routine harassment fire, were redirected to focus on the coordinates Chen had provided, based on his study of likely enemy positions. At 14:23 hours, one of the spotter planes reported what its pilot initially thought was a trick of light and shadow among the olive groves. Closer examination revealed camouflage netting, and beneath that netting, the unmistakable angular shapes of armored vehicles. Within minutes, the other aircraft confirmed the sighting. Hidden in the hills overlooking the coastal highway was not a company of infantry, but an entire armored battalion, positioned exactly where it could devastate an American advance. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stared at the map as radio reports poured in, each one adding details to the emerging picture. 20-plus armored vehicles, extensive infantry support, prepared positions with clear fields of fire. It was, in every respect, a perfect ambush, missing only the arrival of its intended victims. When was the attack scheduled to begin? Harrison asked, though he already knew the answer. Tomorrow morning, 0600 hours, sir. 2 battalions advancing along the coastal highway toward objectives Baker and Charlie. Harrison did the mathematics in his head. Approximately 800 American soldiers would have advanced directly into the killing zone, facing an entrenched enemy with superior positioning and armored support. Casualties would have been catastrophic, potentially breaking the back of the entire offensive and forcing a general withdrawal that would surrender weeks of hard-won territory. Cancel tomorrow's attack. Get division on the line. I want every artillery piece we can spare targeting those positions, and I want it now. At 1500 hours, the first artillery shells began falling on Major Richter's carefully concealed positions. The German commander, who had been reviewing final preparations with his company officers, heard the distinctive whistle of incoming fire and threw himself to the ground as the earth erupted in smoke and thunder. The bombardment was not the scattered harassment fire that both sides exchanged routinely, but a sustained, coordinated barrage that suggested the Americans knew exactly where to aim. Richter crawled to an observation slit as shells impacted across the hillside, sending olive trees spiraling into the air and tearing apart camouflage netting that had taken days to position. Through the smoke, he could see one of his tanks, its concealment stripped away, frantically attempting to maneuver into a less exposed position. The precision of the American fire was terrifying. They were not searching for targets. They were systematically destroying positions whose locations should have been secret. The bombardment continued for 90 minutes, methodical and devastating. When it finally ceased, Richter emerged from his bunker to survey damage that transformed his perfect ambush into a tactical nightmare. 7 of his 23 tanks had been damaged or destroyed. Ammunition stores had detonated in secondary explosions that killed dozens of soldiers, and the carefully prepared positions were now exposed and vulnerable. More importantly, the element of surprise that made the entire operation viable had evaporated. Richter radioed his divisional headquarters with a situation report that marked the effective end of the planned counter-offensive. Without surprise and with significant casualties already sustained, launching an attack would be operationally suicidal. The division commander, reviewing the same facts, ordered Richter to withdraw his remaining forces under cover of darkness, abandoning positions that had taken weeks to prepare and surrendering the initiative back to the Americans. For Captain Chen and his patrol, the afternoon brought a very different experience. They had withdrawn to a safe distance and watched as artillery fire turned the hills ahead into a landscape of smoke and flame. Chen still did not understand how intelligence had so dramatically underestimated enemy strength, but he was profoundly grateful that they had discovered the German positions before driving into them blind. Private Whitaker, sitting in the back of the half-track with his headset still pressed against his ears, felt a strange disconnection from the destruction unfolding in the distance. He had transmitted the report that triggered the artillery barrage, but he did not fully comprehend his role in the afternoon's events. Exhaustion had finally caught up with him, and he dozed fitfully while explosions rumbled like distant thunder. It was not until the following morning that the truth began to emerge. Lieutenant Morrison, reviewing his transmission logs, noticed a discrepancy between what he had sent and what battalion operations had received. He had clearly transmitted company strength approximately 150, yet the report from Chen's patrol had indicated battalion strength approximately 1,050. Morrison brought the discrepancy to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, expecting perhaps a reprimand for unclear communication. Instead, Harrison studied the logs with an expression that shifted from confusion to dawning realization to something approaching wonder. "Lieutenant, if your transmission said company strength, but Captain Chen reported battalion strength, that means somewhere in the chain, the message was misunderstood." "Yes, sir. I believe the error occurred with Private Whitaker, Captain Chen's radio operator. He must have misheard the transmission." Harrison leaned back in his chair, staring at the canvas ceiling of the operations tent. "So let me understand this correctly. A 19-year-old radio operator, probably exhausted after a night shift, misheard a routine transmission. He reported enemy strength as 10 times greater than intelligence indicated. That mistake caused us to abort an attack that would have driven 2 battalions straight into an ambush, and instead we destroyed the ambush before it could be sprung." "That appears to be accurate, sir." Harrison laughed, a sound that started as a chuckle and built into something louder and more unrestrained. "Lieutenant, do you understand what you are telling me? We are alive. Hundreds of men are alive because a kid could not keep his eyes open long enough to accurately copy a radio message." Morrison allowed himself a careful smile. "Should I reprimand Private Whitaker for the communication error, sir?" "Reprimand him? I am going to recommend him for a commendation. That mistake saved more lives than a month of perfect intelligence work." When Captain Chen learned the truth, his reaction was more complicated. He found Whitaker performing routine maintenance on the radio equipment, the young private's movement still showing the lingering effects of exhaustion. Chen stood watching him work for a long moment before speaking. "Private Whitaker, I need to ask you about yesterday's transmission from battalion." Whitaker straightened immediately, recognizing the seriousness in his captain's tone. "Yes, sir. What exactly did you hear when Lieutenant Morrison sent the enemy strength estimate?" Whitaker consulted his notepad, reviewing the hurried scrawl he had made 24 hours earlier. "Battalion strength, approximately 1,050 infantry, sir. That is what I recorded and reported to you." Chen nodded slowly. "Private, the actual transmission said company strength, approximately 150. You misheard it by an order of magnitude." The blood drained from Whitaker's face as he understood what was being said. He had made a critical error, the kind of mistake that in military operations could cost lives and end careers. "Sir, I do not know what to say. I was exhausted, but that is no excuse. I should have requested clarification if I was uncertain." Chen held up a hand to stop the flow of apologies. "Private, let me finish. Your mistake caused us to abort our reconnaissance mission. It caused battalion to halt a planned attack. And because we halted that attack, reconnaissance discovered a major enemy force that was positioned to ambush us. If you had heard the transmission correctly, if you had reported company strength instead of battalion strength, we would have proceeded as planned. 2 battalions would have advanced this morning into a killing zone. Casualty estimates suggest we would have lost 500 men in the first hour." Whitaker's expression shifted from horror to confusion. "Sir, I do not understand." "Your mistake saved hundreds of lives, Private. The German forces were concentrated exactly where you accidentally suggested they were, except in even greater strength than your misheard report indicated. You made an error, but it was the most fortunate error in this regiment's history. The story of Private Whitaker's mistake spread through the division with the velocity of folklore, growing and mutating with each retelling. Some versions claimed he had deliberately changed the report based on intuition. Others suggested divine intervention or supernatural prescience. The truth that the exhausted teenager had simply misheard a radio transmission seemed almost disappointingly mundane compared to the mythologized versions. But for military historians and operational planners studying the incident in later years, the mundane truth contained lessons far more profound than any mythological alternative. The Italian campaign had demonstrated repeatedly that modern warfare was a system of vast complexity, where thousands of individual actions and decisions cascaded into strategic outcomes that no single mind could fully predict or control. In such a system, the potential for error was enormous, and most errors carried severe consequences. What made Private Whitaker's mistake extraordinary was not that it occurred, but that it occurred at precisely the moment and in precisely the way that transformed disaster into victory. Had he misheard the transmission an hour earlier or later, had he confused different numbers, had Captain Chen dismissed the report as implausible, the outcome would have been entirely different. The narrow corridor between catastrophe and triumph was measured not in miles or hours, but in a few misunderstood words transmitted through static by an exhausted soldier. Major Richter, withdrawing his battered battalion under cover of darkness, had his own perspective on the afternoon's events. From his viewpoint, the Americans had somehow penetrated German communication security, discovered his positions through espionage or aerial reconnaissance, and responded with devastating precision. The idea that blind luck and a transcription error had unraveled weeks of careful planning never occurred to him. He wrote in his after-action report that American intelligence capabilities had reached new levels of sophistication, a conclusion that would influence German defensive planning for the remainder of the Italian campaign. This misperception carried its own strategic consequences. German commanders, believing the Americans possessed superior intelligence-gathering capabilities, became more cautious about concentrating forces, more prone to dispersing units to avoid detection, and more hesitant to maintain static positions that might be identified and targeted. This defensive mindset, born from a misunderstanding of American capabilities, actually played into American strategic advantages in mobility and firepower. The planned American advance, postponed by Whitaker's misheard transmission, was rescheduled for 3 days later after reconnaissance confirmed German forces had withdrawn from the coastal sectors. When American troops finally moved forward, they encountered only scattered resistance, advancing in 1 day farther than the original plan had projected, for an entire week. The strategic crossroads that had been the objective of the aborted attack was secured without significant casualties, opening supply routes that would support operations through the summer of 1944. Captain Chen recommended Private Whitaker for a Bronze Star, though division headquarters ultimately decided against the award on the grounds that commending a soldier for making a mistake, however fortunate its consequences, set an uncomfortable precedent. Instead, Whitaker received a letter of appreciation from Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and a 3-day pass to Naples, where he spent most of the time sleeping in a requisitioned hotel room that smelled of salt air and distant lemon groves. When Whitaker returned to duty, Chen assigned him to a different role, rotating him away from communications work, not as punishment but as pragmatic acknowledgement that the psychological weight of his mistake-turned-miracle might compromise his effectiveness. Whitaker spent the remainder of the war as a supply clerk, a position that better suited his methodical personality and allowed him to contribute without the constant stress of real-time decision-making under combat conditions. Years after the war, in 1968, a military historian researching the Italian campaign interviewed Whitaker, who was by then a 53-year-old postal worker in Pennsylvania, with 3 children and a carefully tended vegetable garden. The historian wanted to understand what Whitaker remembered about the incident, what insights he could provide about decision-making under stress and the role of chance in military operations. Whitaker's response was characteristically modest. "I was tired," he said. "I heard something wrong. Captain Chen trusted me enough to take my report seriously, and battalion trusted Captain Chen enough to act on it. If anyone deserves credit, it is the officers who made decisions based on incomplete information and got lucky. I just made a mistake. The historian pressed further, asking whether Whitaker believed fate or providence had played a role, whether some higher purpose had guided his exhausted mishearing toward an outcome that saved hundreds of lives. Whitaker considered the question carefully, sipping coffee from a mug that declared him world's best dad. "I think," he said finally, "that war is chaos, and chaos sometimes produces good outcomes and sometimes produces terrible ones. And we remember the good outcomes because they make us feel like there is meaning in all of it. Maybe there is meaning. Maybe my mistake happened for a reason, or maybe it was just a tired kid who could not hear straight after being awake too long. I do not know which explanation is true, and I am not sure it matters. What matters is that hundreds of men went home to their families who would not have if things had gone differently. I can live with that." The historian included this quote in his book, published in 1971, as an example of what he called radical contingency in military operations. The book argued that conventional military history, with its focus on great generals and master strategies, fundamentally misunderstood how wars were actually fought and won. Real warfare, the historian argued, was a continuous improvisation, a desperate attempt to impose order on inherently chaotic systems where communication failed. Plans collapsed and outcomes depended as much on accident as intention. Private Whitaker's Misheard transmission became a case study in military academies, used to illustrate points about the importance of redundant communication systems, the dangers of command structures that relied too heavily on unverified information, and the role of human factors in operational planning. Generations of officers studied the incident, drawing lessons about everything from fatigue management to the need for confirmation protocols. But perhaps the most important lesson remained unwritten in official doctrine, residing instead in the unspoken understanding shared by every soldier who had experienced combat. That survival often depended less on courage or skill than on chance, on being in the right place instead of the wrong one, on a message delayed or an order misheard, on the 1,000 tiny accidents that accumulated into the difference between life and death. Private Whitaker's mistake was remarkable, not because it was unique, but because its consequences were visible and dramatic enough to recognize. How many other mistakes, how many other mishearings and miscommunications had similarly decisive impacts that remained forever unacknowledged? The coastal highway in Italy, where these events unfolded, is today a scenic route traveled by tourists who stop at hillside restaurants to enjoy views of the Adriatic Sea. The hills where Major Richter positioned his ambush are covered in olive groves that have been tended by the same families for generations. Nothing visible marks the location where artillery shells fell in the spring of 1944, where a perfectly planned ambush was destroyed before it could be sprung, where hundreds of lives were saved by a transmission that arrived garbled by exhaustion and static. But for those who know the story, the landscape carries its own quiet testimony to the fragile nature of human affairs, to the thin margin between disaster and deliverance, and to the profound truth that history's most consequential moments often emerge not from the grand designs of generals and statesmen, but from the small, fallible actions of exhausted soldiers trying to do their jobs as well as circumstances permit. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.